It's always a joy to speak on an issue that's important to my heart. We're dealing with the whole issue of Israel and the land, and the future of Israel. This is going to be our topic from a church history perspective. Just really honored to be here. I look at the list of the speakers that are on here. I was thinking to myself that if I wasn't speaking here, I would still travel to be at this conference. Many of the men here have had a great influence on my thinking, and I use a lot of their textbooks in my various classes. So I'm enjoying not only being a part of this, but also, sitting in the pew and learning with everybody else. So I'm just having a great time, and just thank you for the opportunity here. So anyway, as I mentioned, our topic is going to be the whole issue of Israel, particularly the people of Israel, the land, and the future of Israel in church history. Most of the messages that we've heard so far have been from the Bible, the biblical perspective on Israel, and that's the way it should be. But it's also good, too, to have a church history perspective, and that's my goal today, is just to give you a survey of some of the major issues and ways that the church has understood Israel throughout history. And as we'll see, it'll be a mixed bag. Sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's not so good. Sometimes even certain individuals in church history may say some good things, and then some other things that are not so good. So it is helpful. One of the reasons why I like to study church history is because I want to learn from those who have done right and emulate their godliness and learn from their sound doctrine. But also on the other side, if there's been some mistakes that have been made, and there have been many in regard to Israel throughout history, I want to learn from that as well, and to perhaps avoid some of the errors and the pitfalls that people have fallen into. And I definitely think that ends up being the case when you look at some of the replacement theology or supersessionism that has been held throughout history. So as we're doing this church history survey, I just want to point out that there ends up being four major eras of church history. There ends up being the first one is the patristic era, or the era of the fathers, which takes roughly from the death of the Apostle John around AD 100 through into the mid 400s. And so that's the first era. And then there's another era, which we call usually call the Middle Ages, which takes place from the middle of the 5th century up until the time of the Reformation in the early part of the 16th century. And then a third era would be the era of the Reformation, and that, again, is the 16th century. And then after that, once you get into the 17th century, you're dealing with a post-Reformation era. And so we're going to be surveying that. Probably most of the things that I'll say will be in regard to the first part, in regard to how things were viewed pertaining to Israel in the patristic era, but we'll also make some statements about the others, and then I think I'll end with some really positive statements concerning how there's been some good developments in the post-Reformation era and how people have viewed Israel. There still is a replacement theology that remains very much entrenched, there's no doubt about that, but there's also been some positive developments as well. So we'll move on here with our presentation. Like I said, most of my message here will be coordinated with the notes that you'll see on the screen. Throughout church history, there have been two main approaches to Israel's role in the plan of God. We could call these two main approaches or two main trajectories. There can be variations within each of these, but the first one is the replacement view, and then the second one would be the restoration view. The replacement view, which we've already alluded to, would be the view that the church has replaced or superseded Israel as the people of God. So that would be the view that Israel was the people of God in the Old Testament, but now the church has taken over Israel's role permanently to such an extent that you should not expect any restoration of Israel to their land or to have any sort of special role to the nations in the future. And along with that has often come the view that the church is the new Israel, or the true Israel, or the true spiritual Israel. There's different forms of replacement theology. I won't go into all that, but at its core is the belief that the New Testament church is the new Israel, and Israel will not be restored as a nation. The second view would be the opposite of that. That would be the restoration view, which would be the belief that God does have plans for Israel. Yes, Israel has experienced judgment, according to Luke, the end of Luke 19, verses 41 to 44, and Luke chapter 21, verses 20 to 24 indicate that there were very serious consequences facing the people of Israel because of their rejection of Christ. But the restoration view holds that there is going to be a future salvation and restoration of the nation Israel. And I want to mention those two particular terms because I think it's important. Those who are restorationists would affirm that there is a salvation of Israel, but it's also true that some who would not hold what we would hold to would perhaps say that yes, in the end times there may be a lot of Jewish people who will get saved. But so there are some people who would hold us to a salvation but not a restoration. I think when you're dealing with the restoration, not only does that encompass the idea of a large ingathering of Jewish people coming to Jesus the Messiah, but that they would also be restored as a nation. And that's really what we're getting at, is when you get into the concept of the restoration, you're dealing with that God is going to use them as a nation again, that when Jesus comes again, he's coming to rule the nations, and Israel will have a role during the millennial kingdom in regard to the nations. So that's an important concept to remember. Now, this is the point where I get like about 75 seconds to preach, okay, on this particular issue. I'm doing a lot of church history here, but I just want to say that I really believe strongly that the New Testament writers and those who are quoted in the New Testament utterly reject what we would call now a replacement theology. On many occasions, and of course including Romans 11, but beyond Romans 11, there's many indicators that Israel is still going to have a future in the plan of God. I'm not going to read all these passages for you, but in Luke 1:32-33, it was told of Jesus that he would be the one who would someday assume David's throne and rule over the house of Jacob forever. In Matthew chapter 19:28, Jesus says that in the regeneration, in the coming cosmic renewal, that he's going to sit on his glorious throne, and the 12 apostles are going to be ruling over the 12 tribes of Israel. As a matter of fact, that verse is so strong, if that were the only affirmation of Israel's future in the New Testament, that would be enough. Matthew chapter 23, verses 37-39, this passage has been talked about before, but it promises in verse 39 that there is coming a day in which Israel will say with the correct heart, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. In Acts chapter 1, verse 6, after many days of kingdom instruction from the risen Lord, according to Acts 1:3, the disciples were asking, Lord, is it this time that you're restoring the kingdom to Israel? Which showed that even after a 40-day seminary instruction from the risen Lord, they were expecting the restoration of the kingdom, to which the Lord said, that's not for you to know, but heavily implied that it is coming. Romans chapter 9, verses 4-5, Paul in the present tense says that the covenants and the promises and the temple service still belong to Israel. He says, to whom belongs? And of course, Romans 11:25-26, where we see that all Israel will be saved, and it's linked with the coming deliverer, and it's also linked with the new covenant in the verses that are following that, a very explicit statement of the coming salvation and restoration of Israel. Revelation chapter 7, verses 4-8 talks about 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and then they're contrasted with the multitude of Gentiles who are also coming to faith during that particular time. A very strong affirmation of the importance of the 12 tribes of Israel in God's plans. So many, many reaffirmations, and those aren't the only ones, but those are just some that I could point out here. Yet it has also been true, even in light of those clear passages, that the mostly Gentile church has often struggled with the erroneous view that the church has replaced Israel in God's plans. There's no doubt that that has been a struggle at times. In Romans chapter 11, verse 1, Paul said this, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. And he says that very strongly and emphatically, that can't be the case. And he explains how, he himself is an Israelite, and there's a remnant of Israel who will come to faith. And then he talks about all Israel who will be saved. But I take it by the very fact that he brought that up, that he's not just bringing it up for no reason. There must have perhaps been some tendency amongst those who he was writing to perhaps to start thinking that way. So the very fact that he addressed it seemed to indicate that there was an issue there. And of course, he deals with that very strongly with the rest of Romans 11, as I'm sure you're aware. I think AD 150 ends up being a pretty significant time because there is some debate when it comes to when replacement theology actually starts. Like I said, there may have been a hint of it as Paul addresses it in Romans 11:1. But it seems like a lot of scholars think that around AD 150 is a good time to kind of put a peg in the wall when it comes to dating replacement theology. It's at that particular time an individual named Justin Martyr, he became the first to explicitly identify the church as Israel. And so if you're looking for a key individual, it would be he in that regard. Now, Justin's one of those who I told you can be a mixed bag. There's several times he'll say some things that are really good. He was He was premillennial, and he was actually looking forward to a salvation of the Jews to come, but he also identified the church as Israel, which I don't think is quite right. So the early church affirmed premillennialism. That's one of the things that the early church did, which was good. It affirmed premillennialism. Eventually, that would give way to amillennialism and a spiritualized view of the millennial kingdom once you get into the 400s. So the early church affirmed premillennialism and a future salvation of Israel, but also started to identify the church as Israel and did not emphasize as much a future restoration of the nation Israel. So I think it's that patristic era, which takes you, up until the early 400s, as it begins to unfold and it gets later in that era, there starts to be more of a replacement theology that really starts to sink in. I think there are three reasons, perhaps there are more, but just for summary, I think there are three reasons in particular where we can track and say, we think that these had some contributions as to why the church started to go more towards a replacement view. And in a sense, I kind of view these as the ingredients that help make the replacement theology soup. These are the things that I think helped it to grow and to become popular. And the first one would be the increasing Gentile presence in the church. And, what's going to happen particularly after AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem, as time goes on, the church is going to become very much dominated by Gentiles. And, of course, we're glad I'm a Gentile. I've come to faith in Jesus the Messiah. That's a good thing. But just historically, there's often been a tendency for those, when the church becomes mostly Gentile, to perhaps start to have some questions about Israel's place in the plan of God. I don't think it should be the case. I wish that it wasn't the case, but that oftentimes has happened. And the church became increasingly Gentile, and more of its leadership started to become, we're Gentiles. There just were naturally questions about Israel's role in the plan of God. Secondly, the thing I mentioned up here is the perception that the AD 70 and 135 destructions of Jerusalem were God's permanent rejection of Israel. And I think the key word there is permanent. Because like I said, I think the end of Luke 19 and some of Luke 21 are indicating that the AD 70 destruction was biblically significant and actually predicted. I would even say in Daniel 9, as Dr. Feinberg talked about earlier, and in the two Luke passages that I mentioned. I think the thing that's different here, though, is there's several quotes from some of the church fathers of that particular time who actually viewed those destructions as a permanent rejection of the nation Israel. Another factor also, too, would be the rise of allegorical interpretation. Allegorical interpretation, particularly when you get into the 200s and into the 300s, particularly through the influence of the Alexandrian tradition, it's just been well documented that allegorical interpretation was very heavily influential in the Christian church. And it became much more easy for Christians to take national and physical promises that were given in the Old Testament and to spiritualize those or to transfer them to the church or to identify the church as the spiritual Israel. So allegorical interpretation was a major factor. So I think when you put all those three together, you can see the setting for the developing and eventually will become a firmly entrenched replacement theology or supersessionism within the church. One individual who was looking at this particular issue said, quote, "What is singularly absent from early millenarian schemes is the motif of the restoration of Israel. The church fathers from the 2nd century on did not encourage any notion of a revival of national Israel. Yet, on the positive side, there are still, and were still, some fathers that looked forward to some sort of future for Israel." And this is where I said you have to be a little bit careful and discerning because, like I said, there definitely is a trend towards replacement theology. But you still do see some fathers of the time still making some pretty good statements. Justin Martyr, who I referred to earlier, I'm just going to read the last part of the quote there that's in bold. But he did mention that there was going to be a resurrection of the dead, that there was going to be 1,000 years in Jerusalem. So we looked to Justin as one who affirmed premillennialism, which was definitely a good thing. Then he also says, which will then be built, adorned, and enlarged, the prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah and others declare. So he was looking forward to a future salvation of Jewish people, and it's good to see that he also linked that with Old Testament prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah. And I think that's important because I think a lot of the people that we would call replacement theologians or fulfillment theologians today often view the New Testament as reinterpreting or transcending the Old Testament promises. So I've actually made a kind of a laundry list of theologians who have made those sorts of statements. Oftentimes you see theologians today saying there's a reinterpretation, there's a redefining, there's a transcending of those things, and at least good to see with this particular quote that there's some literal reliance upon the Old Testament prophets. Tertullian also made a good statement, when he said that it will be fitting for the Christians to rejoice and not to grieve at the restoration of Israel, if it be true that the whole of our hope is intimately united with the remaining expectation of Israel. So even though this period appears to be not doing so well over time, there's still some positive statements, at least earlier on. Jerome also talked about the fact when the Jews received the faith at the end of the world, which was a good statement. Since this message is also dealing with the whole issue of the land of Israel, I also wanted to point out some issues of the land in regard to church history. Although there was the belief, I think, in the early church era of a future salvation of Jewish people, they did not have much interest in the land of Israel. In the earliest days of the Christian church, there does not appear to have been any kind of perceived benefit from undertaking a pilgrimage. And again, I'm not saying that it's mandatory that a person must do a pilgrimage to Israel, although we all know that can be very beneficial for understanding the layout of the land and all that. But during that particular time, not much interest in the land, but eventually there started to grow more interest. A scholar once wrote that initially the idea of pilgrimage was seen as something voluntary and optional. Jerome, interestingly, viewed pilgrimages to Israel as beneficial. He made a statement here where he said, "So we also understand the scriptures better when we have seen Judea with our own eyes," which I think is a pretty good statement. But there were also some others like Augustine, John Chrysostom, Gregory, and others that were actually discouraging people from going to see the land of Israel. And of course, Constantine and Helena, they did much to encourage Christian interest in the land, being involved with marking and establishing, various Holy Land sites so that we can know where those are, which has been helpful. So as we come out of that era, as I mentioned before, you're seeing some good, you're seeing some not so good. There's definitely statements of premillennialism. There's definitely statements there of a future salvation of Israel. But it's also true that the overall trend is more towards a replacement approach. And I would even say that when you get to the Middle Ages, you got to remember, coming right before the time period that I have mentioned here in 500, you have Augustine, who lives from 354 to 430, who becomes known as the father of Amillennialism, and he becomes very influential. And with Amillennialism, there definitely is a spiritualizing of the kingdom. You're not looking for a literal 1,000-year kingdom to come. The idea that the church has become the new Israel has become very strongly entrenched. So when you hit this particular period of this 1,000-year period, there is a very, very strong Augustinian amillennialism with very little expectation concerning the restoration of Israel. So as we're looking at it from a church history perspective, things are more bleak during this particular time. Yet, if you look hard enough, there still ends up being some glimmers of hope for Israel during this time. And you have to look pretty hard, but there are some. Thomas Aquinas, for example, who ends up being probably the most famous theologian of the Middle Ages period. I'm not going to read all of that up there, but Thomas Aquinas had a statement where he affirmed that he thought that Romans 11:26 was actually teaching that there would be a salvation of the Jewish people in the end times. I don't think that was a full, what we would call a restoration view, but he did hold to a future salvation of the Jews. Probably the closest thing I think that I have found personally, I'm not saying this is the only one, but John of Skissa ended up holding to, I think, what could be considered a restoration view. I didn't list all the quotes from him, but a scholar who studied him said, for him, for John, the converted Jews would become God's new imperial nation, and Jerusalem would be completely rebuilt to become the center of the purified faith. And so I think that was a kind of a rare view, but he did hold to that during that time. And of course, when it comes to the whole issue of the land, there ends up being the issue of the Crusades. So those begin in 1095, and they end up being a way in which to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. Pope Urban II, who launched the Crusades, viewed the Crusades as a way of renewing the church and leading to pilgrimages to Israel that could usher in the return of Christ. So I found that to be somewhat interesting there. So that's obviously not a restorationist view in the sense of a biblical sense, but he felt that pilgrimages to the land would renew spiritual interest and could actually lead to the second coming. Regina Sheriff points out, though, that prior to the Reformation, as we're at the end of this period of the Middle Ages, traditional Catholic thought had no place for the possibility of a Jewish return to Palestine nor any such concept as the existence of a Jewish nation. So, again, very, very bleak during this time. And, of course, of all the four eras that we've talked about, I think this would be the bleakest because you have 1,000 years where, like I said, a Augustinian Amillennialism is holding sway. Then you get to that third era. Remember, we have the early church era, and then the Middle Ages, and then you roll into the Reformation era, of which we are grateful for with the theological developments and the return to Scripture and the important solas and sola fide and sola scriptura and those important doctrines. But when you come to the primary reformers, now again, I think their interests were primarily in other areas that they were dealing at the time and not so much on eschatological matters. But I think the first generation of reformers, for the most part, I think went along mostly with the prevailing tradition that had been before. So now the issue of Martin Luther, I think he's come up in another message or two. One of the interesting things about Martin Luther was that the early Luther actually expected for there to be a salvation of the Jewish people. He believed that he was living in the end times, and he expected there to be a conversion of the Jewish people. So the early Luther was fairly positive toward the Jewish people, but most of us know what ends up happening on the flip side. With the later Luther, he becomes, I think, very embittered against the Jewish people, and makes some very, very strong anti-Semitic statements, very, very strong replacement theology statements, very strong statements that the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 was a permanent rejection, and that Israel would never again be the people of God in any sense. And of course, the 1543 tract concerning the Jews and their lies, I'm not going to go through the litany of all the things that Martin Luther stated, but I will give you one. Luther did say, "Therefore the Jews have lost this promise. No matter how much they boast of their father Abraham, they are no longer the people of God." Willem van Gemeren points out that John Calvin did not have a clearly defined position on Israel. His position would have been much more moderate compared to Luther's. Various scholars who've looked at, I remember even one Calvin scholar even said Calvin's views are almost a little bit maddening because there's sometimes where he seems to really indicate a salvation of Israel from his Isaiah commentary, but then he makes other statements that were pretty strong replacement theology. So I think you could consider him to be a replacement theologian, although not as strongly as Martin Luther. After that, though, I think things, for a large part of the story, get better. The Geneva Bible of 1581 actually made a pretty positive statement when it said that he, referring to Paul, showeth that the time shall come that the whole nation of the Jews, though not every one particularly, shall be joined to the church of Christ. So most scholars think that statement was referring to a salvation of the Jewish people. The 17th century then would see an explosion of interest in the future of the Jews in Israel. The Bible is becoming more accessible to people. There's more of an interest in studying Hebrew. And during this time, I think there's a lot of good things said about the people of Israel. In his study, Ian Murray, the Reformed scholar and historian, noted that, quote, "belief in a future conversion of the Jews became commonplace among the English Puritans." Thomas Brightman, for example, in his Revelation of the Apocalypse in 1615 said, "Shall they return to Jerusalem again? There is nothing more certain. The prophets do everywhere confirm it and beat upon it." Sir Henry Fitch in 1621 published some works referring to the future of Israel. He said, "Where Israel, Judah, and Zion and Jerusalem are named in the Bible, the Holy Ghost meant not the spiritual Israel or the church of God collected of the Gentiles or of the Jews and Gentiles, but Israel properly descended out of Jacob's loins," which seemed to reject more of a spiritual understanding of Israel. The scholar Reiner Smolinski, in an award-winning article, said, "In fact, Puritan millennialists strongly asserted that the restoration and national conversion of the Jews was a prerequisite to the second coming." More statements here. Like I said, I might not read every word of these, but Wilhelmus Brockel made some great statements in regard to the Jewish nation being gathered together from all the regions of the world. He said, will they come to dwell in Canaan and all the lands promised to Abraham, and will Jerusalem be rebuilt? We believe that these events will transpire. They will be an independent republic governed by a very wise, good-natured, and superb government. Those sort of statements seem to indicate at restoration because you're dealing with national implications. And then he goes on to say that Canaan's going to be extraordinarily fruitful, and he links it with Revelation 20. William Perkins, same thing. I'm not going to read all the quote here, but another positive statement about the nation shall be blessed in Abraham, and there will be a gathering of the nation of the Jews. Peter Serrarius in the 17th century said, the time of the conversion of the Jews and the restoring of the kingdom of Israel, of which the prophets are full, is at hand. And again, we could go on and on and on about this. Here's a guy you may have heard of before, Jonathan Edwards, 18th century. Now, he was a postmillennialist. He wasn't a premillennialist, but he goes on record with a very positive statement. What he ends up saying here is, however obstinate the Jews have been, now for above 1,700 years in their rejection of Christ, and however rare have been the instances on individual conversions ever since the destruction of Jerusalem, and then shall the house of Israel be saved. The Jews and all their dispersions shall cast away their old infidelity and shall have their hearts wonderfully changed and abhor themselves for their past unbelief and obstinacy. Now notice this is the statement here that I think is interesting. Nothing is more certainly foretold than this national conversion of the Jews in Romans 11:2. It's a very good statement there. Charles Spurgeon, you may have heard of him as well, made some very strong statements which seem to be fairly consistent with the idea of a restoration of Israel. Charles Spurgeon said, it is also certain that the Jews as a people will yet own Jesus of Nazareth, the son of David, as their king, and that they will return to their own land. He also said there will be a native government again. There will again be the form of a body politic. A state shall be incorporated and a king shall reign. Israel has now become alienated from her land. But if there be anything clear and plain, the literal sense and meaning of this passage, and he's referring to Ezekiel 37, which is talking about the dry bones passage and the restoration of Israel and being brought back together again. He says this is a meaning that should not be spirited or spiritualized away. It must be evident that both the 2 and the 10 tribes of Israel are to be restored to their own land. So like Jonathan Edwards, he gives a strong statement, and even this statement would be even stronger. And then, of course, historically, the rise of dispensationalism in the 1800s. John Nelson Darby, the tradition that would follow from him, the Bible Conference movement, the Scofield Reference Bible, the books and the organizations that would come from it have been very, very strong in promoting the idea that the church is not the new Israel, that God still has a future plan for the people of Israel. And so dispensationalism has been very, very influential and a real strong calibration from the replacement theology that oftentimes came before it. Okay, I'm going to skip over a couple here. One of the things I thought was an interesting statistic was that between 1800 and 1875, around 2,000 authors wrote about the Holy Land. It's a pretty significant figure. That's even before the age of the internet, and you got a lot of writers saying a lot of things about Israel and the land. Then, of course, the major developments of the 20th century, which must be mentioned. Perspectives concerning supersessionism or replacement theology have been seriously affected by 2 developments, the Holocaust and the establishment of the modern state of Israel. And I don't think it's an understatement to say that this has been a major earthquake on the theological scene, a major 9.0 on the Richter scale sort of thing. I wish I had time to go through all the denominations that have gone through and reevaluated their beliefs about Israel because of these 2 particular events. But let's just say that the 20th century has definitely been a time period in which there's been some soul searching from various denominations on previous replacement theology views, and there have been some that have gone back and actually repudiated some of the replacement theology. So, of course, these events have no doubt pushed Israel and the church and issues pertaining to them to the forefront of Christian theology. Ronald DeProse writes out that since the tragic events of the Shoah and the birth of the modern state of Israel in 1948, the interest shown in God's ancient people has been widespread and sustained. R. Kendall Solon, who also has written a book on the issue of replacement theology, he's pointed out that under the new conditions created by these events, Christian churches have begun to consider anew their relation to the God of Israel and the Israel of God in the light of the Scriptures and the gospel about Jesus. Oakes notes that Christian reflections on the Jews and Judaism after the Holocaust have generated theological questions of fundamental significance. I didn't list all these questions here, but a lot of them are going to have to do with the whole issue of reevaluating Israel, in Scripture and the role that they play in God's plans and the whole issue of the future of Israel. And then he goes on to say here, which I think can be documented as true, that over the last 2 decades, denominational assemblies have mostly done away with the traditional doctrine that Israel's election has been transferred to the church. And so, now again, that's not a whole, it hasn't happened in every single denomination or in every single church. For those who study the issue, there is still a thriving replacement theology, that still takes place. But there's no doubt when you look at events in regard to in those events of the 20th century that there have been many that have been much more open to God using Israel in his plans. And so, like I said, there still is some pushback. And I would even say today, I'm just trying to perhaps even look at things over the last 20 years. I think that there's perhaps even in evangelical circles, I think there's even somewhat of a resurgence when it comes to replacement theology. If you follow some of the debates or the books that have come out, you can see that there's still a pretty strong challenge. But there's no doubt that the last couple hundred years have been overall have been very good for when it comes to the issue of the church and evaluating issues related to Israel. So when you look at it as a whole, again, I think I've said it a couple times, but the early church was a mixed bag on the issue and definitely went towards replacement theology. When you get to the Middle Ages, that really was a dark time, although there may be a few glimmers of light there, but overall there was a strongly embedded replacement theology. And then when you get to the Reformation, even though the primary reformers themselves may not have initially adopted restorationist views, I do think that there were some implications in regard to studying the Bible and also looking at the significance of the Old Testament and the Hebrew, which I think led to an explosion of interest, I think, that you would see with the Puritans and, of course, eventually with dispensational theology. And then, of course, with the era that we're in, it's been a good period, although there is still a lot of work to be done. And of course, what does that mean for us? I mean, we're at our particular point in history, and I actually do think I'm one of those who believes that even after Jesus comes, there is still time and those sorts of things. I think even in the eternal state there could be, and so I think there's going to come a point where whether Jesus comes soon or not, we're going to look back at our time in history, right? And we're going to be able to evaluate, well, what did the church of 2013 in that particular era believe pertaining to these issues? And of course, I think our goal should be, and I know it's my goal, to have right doctrine in hopefully all areas of the Bible, but also to have a correct view concerning the people of Israel and to be on record as those understanding their role in the plan of God and what the future holds for them as well. All right. Thank you.